welcome everyone to Reach Society's Ask Our Experts. This is our inaugural session in whereby we'll be talking to experts in our communities to really analyze important issues that impact on the modern Black community. Today we have an amazing set of 6 individuals. And what we'll be discussing today and analysing in depth is the Commission of Race and Ethnic Disparity report that was published in March 2021, which has been sort of referred to as the Sewell Report. Now, Reach Society published, or should I say, sent 4 written submissions to the Commission of Race and Ethnic Disparities. And these are around the areas of the criminal justice system, education, employment, and health. And actually you can find all our submissions on those 4 areas. They're actually on our website and published in our newsletter. So today we shall be looking at our 4 submissions. And I'm really delighted with the expert individuals we have here who have all contributed, dare I say, to our 4 written submissions. And we'll also comment about the report per se. So what we're going to do to begin with, as I mentioned, Reach Society written 4 submissions to the Commission of Race and Ethnic Disparity, CREED, we'll call this. And so what we'll do, I'll ask Dwain first of all. So Dwain, I wonder if you could, give us share your thoughts, and you have been the main author of these 4 letters to the Commission. So I wonder if you could give us a background on this matter, please.
Thanks very much for the opportunity to share the backstory to this project, Donald. Although my name appeared at the bottom of all 4 of the submissions, it's important for us to realize that the submissions were all a team effort. And, the start of the journey in July, Reach Society's management team decided that it was very important for the Black community to respond to the Commission. And so we invited a number of community organizations and a number of experts to join with us, and we created 4 working teams. And so it's the effort of those 4 working teams that has actually resulted in the submissions that were sent through to the Commission on Race and Ethnic Disparities. And so after the best part of 3 months' work, we were able to complete our 4 submissions, and between September and early October, those submissions were sent through. And I just want to give the viewer an idea of what was in our submissions. And they all took the same format. And there were 8 key aspects that we raised in them. The first was we told the Commission that we were an alliance of community groups and experts in the modern Black community. And, between our organizations, we have thousands of members of the Black community that we are involved with. We also told the Commission that we welcome the Prime Minister's decision to set up the Commission to look at disparities and inequalities. And we noted in our submission that the trigger was the killing of George Floyd in May, but also the protest by Black Lives Matter, and just about everybody of every ethnic background, people referred to them as an alliance of conscience. We also included in our submission that the midwife to systemic racism, which impacted Western European countries, was Pope Nicholas V, who in the 15th century issued a bull giving permission to the King of Portugal to actually treat all non-Catholics and all Black and brown people as less than human take their possessions and sell them into slavery. And we all know just how that bull impacted Western European behavior, because it led to Western European enslavement of all of those people across the world and the rise of colonialization almost everywhere across the world. But we went further than that in our submission. We mentioned also that Britain played a leading role in the ending of the African slave trade in 1807, and it also ended enslavement in the British Empire in 1834. And in 1948, it took the decision to invite a lot of people from its colonies to come to the UK to live and work to help this country in the recovery from the Second World War. And as we all know, we have established ourselves for now 73 years in the United Kingdom, and we have found ourselves getting involved in pretty much every aspect of British life. But we didn't just stop there. We highlighted the main areas of systemic racism and discrimination in each of the 4 areas, and that may come up again. So we didn't pull any punches when we looked at what was happening in education, not only to the young people in education, but to the Black workers in education. The same thing in employment in terms of the various practices that were impacting Black people, not only in recruitment, but even after they were hired and in the workplace. In the health service, as we know, we looked at how patient care was compromised, but also how professionals in the health sector were being treated, irrespective of their enormous talents and skills. And criminal justice system, I think most of us understand how that is working. A judiciary that has virtually no Black or brown involvement in any significant way, and a police service that willfully will make life difficult for users of the road or people just going about their everyday business. We also looked at, we talked about the effect of systemic racism and discrimination, and we said, we believe, as does the Prime Minister, that the UK has the potential to become a society that is free of systemic racism and discrimination. And we actually said, we believe the government has all the powers necessary to bring that future into existence. But I want to round off this backstory by actually talking about how we experienced our interaction with the Commission and the Cabinet Office. In November, we received a written confirmation that the Cabinet Office and the Commission had received our 4 submissions. So you can imagine our surprise when we saw the report that came out in March, and there was no mention of Reach Society as one of the contributors. So no one should be surprised to find that at the start of April, we wrote a formal complaint to the Cabinet Office, and still we've had no reply to that. And things got worse. A month later, on the 30th of April, we accidentally saw an article in The Guardian in which Reach Society's name was shown as now being added in the amendment to the report. So overall, I would say our experience of the Commission and the Cabinet Office has not been a happy one. And I would go further by saying it's been absolutely appalling the way they've treated us. Thank you, Donald.
Well, thank you. And we're going to come back to that point you raised, Dwain. And so what I'm going to do now, I'm going to get each of our experts to get their point of view, take on this report. You know, what are your overall summary conclusion? We'd like you to keep to about 2 or 3 minutes. And we'll start with Angela.
My overall take is that it's been a lost opportunity. I think there was an opportunity to actually make a fundamental difference in the lives of the modern Black people, and it has been missed. For me, a lot of the report was repetition. Many previous reports had highlighted some of the facts. I feel there was a lack of acknowledgement of the experiences that Black people had faced within this country. I think that there was a total lack. And let me talk about one particular area, because I think certainly when I read the part about mental health, and there was a note that said that this was a particular area of interest for the government, or interest to the commission. The report, in my view, did not pay enough attention to the area of mental health. It didn't acknowledge lived experiences of the people, didn't acknowledge the workforce, even though there has been countless previous reports, countless reviews that highlights the disparities. My feeling is that these previous reports were not taken into account in the way that they should have been, and extracts that were used were then contradicted in part by some of the comments that then followed. So it was a disappointing report for me. I think it has failed a lot of people, and I think it has actually added to the distress that people are already feeling.
At first, when I was invited by Dwain to take part, I was a little bit skeptical as to whether it would deliver something transformative as such, because knowing the background of the chair. But, we talked, Dwain and myself, we talked and felt that there's an opportunity here for us to make a contribution as a group, as an organization. There's that opportunity that we can put something there on the table that would be considered carefully and properly as part of a wider debate. Sadly to say, that, as Dwain has pointed out, seemed not to happen. So it seems to me was an exercise that was not really serious. And the reason why I draw this conclusion is that there have been other reports for a long time. There's a famous one we call the Swan Report back in 1985. That took a long time. It came up with an agenda of education for all. That was actually the title of the report, Education for All. So therefore, for this report by Tony Sewell and others to say that we've made great progress, maybe my words, great progress in education, is not correct according to the facts. At the time when we had SWAN, African Caribbean children were at the lower end of the attainment scale. Today, which is probably 30 odd years hence, we are still at the bottom there. Relatively speaking, the grades may have gone up, but the actual position remains the same. We have not progressed. And what is disappointing for me is that when we had SWAN, it was on the back of a protest and agitation being made by our community. In other words, I'm saying we were the catalyst for getting that commission on stream. And yet, despite our energies in terms of it being on the table, others have benefited more than we have. So to me, to make that conclusion flies in the face of reality. The reality speaks differently. And maybe later on as I come back, we'll develop that. But in summary, this report, number one, is a denial of the reality that we are facing. Number two, it wasn't very thorough. And number three, if it's as a methodology, then it seemed the question that it was trying to answer in terms of a research question is there racism in education? If they tested that question scientifically, then the conclusion that has been drawn flies in the face of really what the evidences are around us today. So in summary, I don't think it provides any meaningful answer to the educational issues which I'm speaking of.
And I have to say, much of the report is full of what I'd say it was misunderstandings, poor and selective analysis, and contradictions. Just to give you an example, the chair quotes the poet and activist Linton Kwesi Johnson and also the Black Lives Matter movement and say how important they are, but then they go on to reject everything that they stand for, which makes no sense to me. Now, I also have to say that there are other things in the report that's interesting. On the positive side, there's a lot of data included in the document and lots of references, and this will help researchers access information on racial disparities. So in a sense, although they've rejected the idea about racism and institutional and structural racism, what they've done is they've actually included a lot of data for people to look for themselves and come to their own conclusions. So accidentally or deliberately, the report has actually put things in the public arena that perhaps a wider audience, most of us might have been aware of them, but a wider audience would not have been aware of. So there's lots of information out there, lots of references that we can look up. There's also a lot of commendable but obvious recommendations, some ignoring facts that are already in the public arena. The report suggests that more research should be done, and this is normally the stock answer. For many years, I've been doing this kind of thing for over 20 years, and whenever you see data like this, people say, oh, it's still not enough, we need to do some more research. So they haven't actually gone anywhere in that. I got the impression that those involved in the commission did not have the capacity, and I'm really sad to say this, or willingness to make the best of the data. In fact, some of the points were quite offensive. Sadly, a lot of the analysis, as I said, was selective and the conclusion flawed or blinkered. And I'm just going to take one example, but well, there are probably more examples, because I looked at two main areas. I concentrated more on two main areas, although I looked through the whole thing, the education area and the health area. Both of those are, if you like, are close to me. And for example, they chose selectively just to talk about the success of Black African students, and they can only do that if they selected it at GCSE level, because before that age and after that age, they didn't really stand out in any way that you can think of. So they didn't sort of consider, why is it that Black African children who did really well at GCSEs, better than white children, by the time they did their A-levels, were performing significantly less well. And by the time they got to university, which they didn't really engage in, again, Black African children and Black children, they're no longer children, they're adults, I should say, were struggling. And there's no explanation for that. They've only chosen that one particular time point, and that's the example that that's how they've done it all through this report. And we see this in health as well, which I might come back to later on. So there's a selective use of data to make the point, because they went to look for disparities. By the way, do tell me to stop, Donald, because I'll go on. They went to look for disparities, but what they were trying to do is show that there aren't any disparities, and so they'd select data where there aren't any disparities. And sometimes, even when they show that there aren't any disparities, there are lots of obvious reasons why that should be. So, ironically, for most of the recommendations, you need the recommendations that they made. You needed to accept that there is structural racism, yet to deliver these recommendations. Because if you don't accept there's structural racism, you can't deliver on these recommendations. So these are some of the contradictions. Finally, one of the things it was clear as I read through this, and it sort of I was looking through it again today, was it made me really frustrated, because it was clear there's a lot of just not understanding of all the concepts and the ideas and the data. There's just so much of that. And that's really the biggest weakness. I think people who were on this commission didn't really understand what race and racism is and which came first. They don't understand that race is the child, as Ta-Nehisi Coates said, basically. Race is the child of racism. It's not the other way around. You have racism, and then you need to create race to justify it.
I had a look initially at the Sewell's sort of summary at the beginning of the report. And one of the things which he mentions there clearly, it stands out, you know, there is no institutional racism, states it in that. So he's taken something from that report, which he thinks is the most important, or he wouldn't put it there, that there isn't any institutional racism in general. Now that's very important, because I think the expectation of this report was that it was completely designed to primarily produce one conclusion, that all the complaints about institutional racism didn't exist. And this is serious, because this is coming from the Lawrence Macpherson report. And therefore, if this is an attempt to completely negate that very, very important conclusion by Lord Macpherson, then I think we need to, as we say up here in Scotland, to think again. Now, if we then look at the introduction says clearly the purpose of this report is to lay the ground for a country built on full participation and trust of all communities. That is the purpose, it's telling us. And therefore, what the report is saying is to, to lay the ground. So the report is going to tell us, what is already there, which we know, because he's not done any work to find that out. And if you look further down in the introduction, he's telling us, well, everything is much better than 50 years ago. So what are you all complaining about? It's like, you were very ill 50 years ago, but you're not as ill now, but you're still ill. So you should celebrate it. And then he then talks about, were you complaining about management of the country? You've got more BAME people in the government now and the opposition than you've ever had. End of story. What are you complaining about? And therefore, what we have is the Sewell and whomever has done this report has laid the ground. There is nothing they're going to find that's wrong. It's telling us. And therefore, my main criticism of this report is that its science base is embarrassing, because it's meeting expectations. And, I'll come on later to other aspects, such as, how it's tried to use slavery, education, and institutional racism to actually justify that primary conclusion that there is no institutional racism. And if there isn't any, then we're in trouble, because none of our institutions, therefore, have to do anything, because it doesn't exist. It's worrying.
It's a pleasure to be able to contribute towards this debate. Like Keith, at first, when Dwain asked me, I was a little bit kind of, do I really want to put myself through this? But I'm glad. I'm extremely glad that I read the report. As Dwain knows, I've been around this work for a long time. I've been involved in many, many investigations. I was actually telling Angela about an investigation that I did many years ago into a local authority. So I've got some sort of idea about these things. And obviously, I've never been involved in anything this big, like 250 pages. And I think the answer and the problem was always in the terms of reference. Very earlier on in a discussion with Dwain, he sent it to me. And when you read the terms of reference, you thought to yourself, wow, I know where this is going. But having had the kind of experience about doing investigation, and I kind of worked my way through the report, my view of the report is that it kind of reads like a defense lawyer attempting to cause reasonable doubts in the minds of the jury in the face of overwhelming evidence against the client. It has that kind of feeling about it, you know what I mean? And there are kind of a number of things that struck me about the report that, and as Sir Geoff said it, particularly very earlier on, and also what Winston said, that there were some very kind of insulting remarks. They felt like they were meant to be insulting. Derisive writing that's kind of based on opinions that weren't relevant or backed up by any hard evidence. And very early on, I think it was around page 8, there was a classic example of it where I think he mentioned something about that as they proceeded with the investigation and explored the approach for closing disparity gaps. He made the statement that the extent to individuals and their communities could help themselves through their own agency, rather than wait for external forces to assemble themselves to do the job. I think I'm correct in that bit. And I thought, what does that have to do with this committee? And what does invisible external forces mean? I've never heard of it. What are you trying to imply with that statement? Another example of this, as I said, the descriptive writing is to me about the story about slavery. And I know I'm not going to, Sir Geoff is much better than me dealing with this. But the whole idea that the Caribbean experience with respect to the slave period, not only being about profit and suffering, but how culturally African people transformed themselves into Britishness. And I mean, that is crazy stuff. And I can't imagine what state of mind that person could have been in to think this is somehow something that needs to be in the report. But I agree with everybody, and I think it's also very selective. And as you read the report, you could see how it was selective, right? This is what we want, but this is what we need to say to back it up. And this is one of the major reasons why it's been accused of not presenting all the available evidence in certain areas to justify their conclusion. I think it was obvious as you read through it what they were trying to do. I think Angela said this, or somebody, it's also really contradictory. And one of the things I picked up was something that I actually do, which was unconscious bias. I've actually been doing unconscious bias for many years. I was actually trained by an unconscious bias expert to do unconscious bias training. And in the report, as everybody knows, it recommends that you got rid of it. But in the report, it describes unconscious bias. I can't remember what page it was. I think it was the employment bit, been laced with preferences and prejudice. And then you think to yourself, but there's a concept here. And also in the report, there's lots of references to bias. But it then says, we think you should scrap unconscious bias because it doesn't work. It doesn't change attitudes. And we all know, anybody that involved in the field, that it was never meant to change attitude. It's really to change behavior. And you do unconscious bias as part of an overall program of change in an organization.
I agree with the sentiment made more than once that there are some good bits in the 24 recommendations. And if those good bits are actually acted upon, hopefully there will be some change. But, if you put the 24 recommendations to one side and look at the rest of the report, I'm forced to say there was so much denial of reality and blaming the people who are affected. I think at one stage it blamed the community for preventing more Black folks from joining the police services around the country. And that did my head in a little bit. Do you know, what I felt overall is that the denial was so plentiful. I think this commission must have been suffering from cognitive dissonance. There was a view of the world, and they were doing their very best to actually make the report fit that view of the world. And the more they tried to do that, the more it exposed their incompetence and their lack of methodology at every turn. Do you know, if I were to stand apart from the report and give any advice, and this is, you know, in retrospect, it would have been so much better if they said, we know British culture is built on systemic racism, but we also know that steps have been taken to mitigate that, because if you think about the 50s and the 60s and the 70s, those race relations acts and laws have all tried to take the edge of that sort of discrimination, that sort of racial discrimination, that sort of sexism and all of that. But there wasn't that honesty and that acceptance of reality. And, you know, I'm disappointed with Tony and all the other Black folks who were on the commission for one simple reason. They clearly didn't know that Sir Arthur Lewis, who is a renowned economist and lectured to students from Oxford and Cambridge, and his name is on a building in Manchester, could not find anywhere to live because of racial discrimination in the 40s when he came to this country, studied here and started working here. Or they could not know about Sir Larry Constantine, who booked the Imperial Hotel in London for himself and his wife. And when he got there and they realized it was a Black couple, they did everything they could to deny him taking up that booking. Again, this was in the 1940s. Or dear Professor Sir Geoff Palmer, who is with us today. Without the intervention of a graduate from Leicester University, he would not have been admitted to get his degree and to go on to make his enormous contribution to the brewing industry because of systemic racism. And we all know about the trouble and the hardship of Black students in our schools today. We all know about the Black drivers who are driving nice cars anywhere in the UK, and they're invariably stopped multiple times by the police for trumped up charges. We all know about the indifferent treatment of Black workers, whether you're highly qualified or not, in just about every sector. Tony, all of those are examples of systemic racism. These are normal people trying to go about their everyday living, and they are being treated badly. So, you know, all I can say is the missing culture that wasn't commented on in the report is the UK culture that is driving all of this misery. But, you know, if Boris Johnson, the Prime Minister, is listening, he will take action based on the 24 recommendations, and we will see a change. My guess, though, is he's trying to put as much distance between himself and this report as possible, and nothing will change. That's my feeling.
So thank you all for giving us your overview of the report, and you've really highlighted some key points that for the next 20-30 minutes I want to dig in deeper. So I want to ask a question, and this may really be initially to the scientists that are here. And I think that Geoff and Winston have kind of touched on this. It's the process of what we call the scientific method. So I wonder if, so Geoff and then Winston, you can comment on that, because I noticed equally that was one of the major criticism that and several I think over 400 academics, which is the largest I've ever seen from any report, said, hold on, there's a lack of rigor.
In my sort of scientific career, and you know, I've done a little bit of science, and you know, one of the first things about the scientific method is, what question are you trying to answer? That's the basis of one of the first thing in the scientific method. What are you trying to answer? And then you devise experimentation, etc., to answer that. And therefore, you know, before we come to methodology and etc., is I cannot find which question this report is trying to answer. There isn't any. It is actually stating that, you know, it is the purpose of this project. It says so. The purpose of this report is to lay the ground for a country built, on full participation and trust of communities. That's the purpose. So what he's saying, there is no research here. It's just collection of data. It is not research. The word shouldn't appear in it.
Yeah.
And therefore, because there is no scientific method, therefore what we have is really, this is a review to tell us that that unconscious bias doesn't exist. It is to tell us that institutional racism doesn't exist. It is designed to meet expectations which the government has already laid down in terms of, for example, institutional racism, and institutional racism doesn't exist, and unconscious bias doesn't exist.
I'm going to be a bit more generous than Sir Geoff in terms of saying the question that they were trying to answer was, say, right, or they were trying to basically sort of say, right, is there, if you like, racial disparities in the UK? And so they tried to find evidence for that or against that. And obviously it was clear that their aim was to try and find that there was no racial disparities in the UK. Now, when you're doing this kind of review, you can do just a review where you select, or you can do a systematic review, or even the meta-analysis where you actually, you have inclusion and exclusion criteria and all those kind of things. And you can't just randomly select data, which is effectively what they did. So it wasn't an academic or a scientific type of review. It was just a review. And when you do just a general review, you can actually select what you include and what you don't include. You don't have to sort of say, this is what I'm going to do. And once they've done that, they can then actually make any claims they want. And that's the example I gave with the education thing and the GCSE. They only chose GCSE for Black Africans. They didn't choose anything else. And then when we look at health, they focused heavily on cancer, and they focused heavily on life expectancy and years lost to disease, if you like. And they basically did that in a very selective way. So, for example, they ignored, although it was that, the good thing about the report, as I said, the data is there. So if you know what you're doing, you can, I know in the health in particular, that you can just look at the data and see that they're actually contradicting themselves or not. Yeah. They looked at the data for Scotland, and they didn't use the data, and then they said that's because the data wasn't available for the rest of the UK at the time. Sometimes they criticize the assumptions, because one of the assumptions is that all the health inequalities that we talk about was no longer existed. They existed 10, 15, 20 years ago, but because the UK has been so brilliant at equalizing, if you like, or getting rid of racial disparities, all of those disparities have disappeared. And yet the evidence they use, if you look at it, for example, for cancer, is from 2000 to 2006. That's a primary data they use. So a lot of the data is very, very selective. And the reason they're able to say some of these things is because they compare what happens to people versus who's registered on the GP's lists. And one of the things you find is that the people who are more likely to suffer health disparities, because remember this link, and no one disputes this, the sort of like social determinants of health, basically deprivation and that kind of thing will determine whether you have poor health outcomes. Okay, and in one part of the report, sorry, I'm going all over the place, but I need to. In one part of the report, they're highlighting the fact that Black and other South Asian groups, they're the most deprived, and if you're the most deprived, you're going to suffer more health inequalities. And on another part of the report, they're saying, actually, no, that hasn't happened. And so race can't be playing a part. And they don't seem to understand why, and they can't explain why. And some of them are quite simple. If you're from some of these communities, you live in a big city like London, you live in large families. And as a result of that, just that simple thing, your older people will live longer because you have your family around you. It's not that you necessarily, it's not something that it's not what I'm saying. It's not necessarily by design. You're being forced to live close together because you can't afford to, you know, move out and that kind of thing. So you live together, and as a result, people benefit. And that was one of the reasons, for example, these communities suffered more from COVID, because you had these multi-generational households. They have a positive effect on life expectancy. There are all kinds of contradictions that it required them to really analyze the data and explain the data, but they chose not to because it looked good. I mean, things like lower levels of cancer, but we know, for example, there's also lower level of smoking and drinking in our communities. And so smoking and drinking are one of the key, you know, drivers for cancer. They didn't sort of look at that, but there's just so much. The other thing is they deliberately didn't factor in deprivation directly into all the calculations. There are just so many flaws in how the data was analyzed, and they went there when they thought this data will support what we want to say, but when it didn't support what they want to say, they'd ignore it or put it to one side. So yeah, I could go on and on and on. It was just really, and the more you read it, the more depressed you get about the quality of the words. I was on a call with some people at Oxford University, and someone from BMJ, who ironically I'd been trying to publish some stuff with for months and months and months, and they wouldn't have it. And then, having spoken about some of these issues, and including the disparities thing, they've invited me to write something about the health aspect. So I'm going to be writing something. So I don't want to say too much about it, except to say they really were very selective in how they use the health data, and that is why they're claiming that there's no health disparities. It's sad, and I don't. Some people are saying that they're deliberately doing this. I don't think so. I just think, as I said, I don't think they understood what they were doing, or that it's more about ignorance than sort of. It wasn't sort of like a mad, you know, a scheme, a deliberate scheme. I just think it was about competence or incompetence.
When I looked at the foreword and I looked at what the Prime Minister had requested, you start from the beginning of what he had actually requested to be done. He wanted the report to look at the state of race relations today. Not quite sure whether that has been done. I don't think so. He said that he wanted a thorough examination of why there were so many disparities exist. And I'm not sure that the report did that. Actually, it basically, in my view, tried to dampen down and dilute the data, because there is data. We know that there is historical data as well, but it also said, what can we do to eliminate or mitigate? Now, to do that, you actually, as I think many have said on the floor today, that you actually have to accept that it exists. And if you don't accept that, then you're not going to be able to tackle it. Let me just refer to one instance where in the report, and again under mental health, because that kind of intrigued me. It caused me to even go and look at some of the research, the research mentioned, like the Wesley Review and others. But it was interesting that the Wesley Review found that Black people were 8 times more likely to be subjected to community treatment orders than white people, and 4 more times likely to be detained. But what it then did was quickly jump onto something else, because it actually didn't look at the court, didn't actually look at why that would be, or, you know, and this was what was asked. It was actually look at what are the disparities. If you can see that, you know, 8, you know, that's the difference, 8 times more likely to be detained, and you don't actually look at why, the potential of why that could be, and then all you can then say is actually we need to then maybe help ourselves then, because it doesn't actually talk about the actual institution, why it's happening, you know, the treatment, the different levels of treatment. Why is it that you would have more detainments for Black people? That wasn't, it was almost as if the data was there, the research was there, but then it was just skirted over, and that's just one example. There are so many examples like that as you go along the report. And for me, it's disheartening, because again, you know, what it doesn't do, it doesn't give voice to the people who have experienced it. It doesn't give voice to the service users who are experiencing this kind of treatment in these places that are providing the support. But also what it does, when you look at another disparity, as you've talked about, the frontline workers and them not being able to actually go up the ladder. and being kept at, at a certain level, it actually doesn't address it, almost as if it turns it back on us. Well, why aren't you? Why can't you? Why haven't you? These people have managed to do it. Why haven't you? So I concur with what Winston is saying, and as I said, by going through the report, there are so many examples of where I've seen that happen.
What's almost going on, and I'd like to get your take on this. Keith mentioned at the beginning, and you, Paul, mentioned this, and what Sir Geoff was saying, well, look, these guys went in with an agenda. They went in, the government said, this is what the area we're going to look at. So do you think it's really more a political report? And the reason why I said I want to get your take on this, because you guys have been involved in reports, and I don't know this, because when the government says this is independent, we'll just let the report do what it does. But then I've seen government now defending it, or people from government departments defending it. Should they, or should they just look, this is what it says? Or is it the report has really been more, this is where we're going to shape the politics?
The thing that always struck me about it, I'm sure it's for everybody, that there was no real race experts. I don't think there was one on that panel, which was really strange, that you were going to look into issues around race and ethnic disparities, and you didn't have one individual on the commission who was an expert in that area.
Basically, I'm asking these questions in my guidance notes is to say, basically, how does the report differ to the society's, our submission? Because it seems that our submission was completely different to what was then the final report. Keith, you mentioned the Swan report. You've been an educationalist.
Let me say that the idea of intervention and support for children has been there a long time. We don't need this report to tell us that.
Right.
In fact, some of us have been doing it for a long time. The supplementary schools have been doing that for a long time.
Yeah.
It's intervention and try to plug the gap for children. So we did not need that. I think, as I said before, those many of the recommendations were out there before. They are drawn from other reports too.
Yeah, that's right.
I think I share the view that in terms of Sir Geoff and others, that that I think this had a clear agenda. It was to deal with the issue of trying to stop the argument.
And this is not a criticism of the authors, but is it a case where the fact is, because this is what's been mentioned, well, the majority of the 9 out of the 10 authors are of diverse group, and so therefore, yeah, that's fine. And what it's almost done, it's almost then stopped any disagreement or discussion from taking place.
In the report, I remember reading something that states that children need to reclaim their British heritage. I'm sure it said that.
It did.
Which is almost, so what does that mean? Because that, just like something that it talked about the Windrush generation were the heroic, this generation is the rebellion, something like that. And when you look at words like that, it's negative. It's not positive, but it doesn't go on then to lay any kind of foundations or state why that those words or those terms are used in any shape or form. It
just to be precise on that before you come in, Winston, which is and maybe it says something, and he talks about the children of those the settlers of the Windrush generation who are now in the 70s and 80s.
Yeah.
He called them, as you write, the rebel generation.
That's it. Yeah.
However, he says this feature running battles with police and breakdown in community relationship, which continues to have a negative legacy.
And now he's saying we should stop protesting because everything is fine. But I just want to quote something from the report that I found that really tells us why you know, we've all got it wrong, and they've got it right, and we're seeing it the wrong way, basically. And it says, right, in a report by the European Union Agency for Fundamental Human Rights on being Black in the EU, revealed the percentage of Black respondents who experienced race or harassment in the past 5 years. And, you know, we're getting it wrong, remember. So the figure was 63% in Finland, 52% in Luxembourg, 51% in Ireland, 48% in Germany and Italy, 41% in Sweden and Denmark. But in comparison, only 21% of Black British respondents reported such harassment, the second lowest in the countries surveyed. So basically what they're saying is that we should be grateful that only 1 in 5 of us have been racially harassed. And we could, if we're lucky that it's not 1 in 2 of us if we lived in Finland or, you know, and that kind of thing. So, and I think that's what they're basically saying, you know, you shouldn't be complaining, you know, it could be worse.
But Tony has been doing 1 or 2 limited briefings. He did one for Policy Exchange at the end of April. And you can actually find the transcript of what he says is on the government website. He seems to have said, no, racism does exist. So he's now commenting to say, oh no, racism does exist. He even mentioned Black women in, you know, pregnant Black women who potentially 4 to 5 times died. So he's acknowledged that. But he's also wanted to comment on the criticism that he made about the slavery remarks of Geoff. And he's saying
he pulled back
it's
on
not
that.
about glorifying slavery. He said, no, it's not about that. And I want to get your take on this, because then afterwards, he's quoting Bob Marley's Redemption song. And it's you can go on the government website, it is there, and he talks old pirates, yes, they rob I. So he's now quoting, you know, Bob Marley, and he's saying that really what slavery is about was it's how African people managed to retain their humanity and resist slavery. That's what he says, that's what it means. It's so, you know, contradictory to what they're saying. So I'd like to get everyone's thoughts on what they found positive about the report.
Okay, I'll go first because I'm going to be very quick. It's sad because you look at something that you think is positive and then they say something negative, but I'm going to start with the positive. And I would say that the end of the word BAME for me would be a positive. But then when I read that it said we no longer see Britain where the system is deliberately ripped against the ethnic minorities, and I then kind of sat back in my seat. So of the recommendations, I suppose that's the only one that I can hold on to with any kind of real positivity. Not saying that there aren't others, because there are. I'm not saying there aren't, but that's the one that I'm going to put forward.
Okay, thank you.
On that, can I just say briefly, Angela, I'm not disagreeing, but this is, and Dwain will remember this because we're at the CRE. We've been round and round the houses with this. We've had racial minorities, visible minorities, minority groups, ethnic minorities, Black and minority ethnic, Black and it just gone on and on and on and on.
I know.
They're not going to be able to come up with a solution. So it's an acronym.
Modern Black community sounds good to me.
Yeah, I mean, that's you know, it's but I don't think it's something with all, you know, that we should really kind of get too hung up about. And it was interesting that it was one of the few things that they leaked before the report was published, which was quite deliberate to distract people. I mean, for me, Donald, I mean, I'm going to be biased because of my work as mainly as an equality and diversity consultant. Of course, is the EHRC and the recommendation to you know, give it more money to and also to encourage it to use its powers. It's something that if you talk to other colleagues that was at the CRE, the Equal Ops Commission, the Disability Rights Commission, it was a painful experience for all of us when those organizations were consumed into the HRC. And I think that you would probably, if you did a survey, you'd find all of us really desperately feeling that organization needs to be overhauled. And so I saw that as a surprise, but as a positive.
Donald, can I come in here?
Yes, certainly.
There are a number of positives, and I think people have said that as we've gone along, but you know, I've identified 4 where if work is done in those 4 areas, there will be a positive impact. Absolutely, police community relations need to be improved. And if what is suggested there is sincerely applied, then there should be change, and for the better. Looking at the Office for the health sector, I think that's an important move, because there is so much transformation that needs to happen in that sector. When you think of the proportion of Black and brown people who are actively involved in it, it really is in need of transformation. Keith would never forgive me if I didn't mention the fitness of teachers in education. An awful lot of work needs to be done to ensure that more of our teachers are up to the task. And it's not about just the curriculum, it's about the competency of the teachers. And that recommendation needs to be applied. And of course, I'm agreeing with Paul, because if the EHRC is supported to do the work that they have in the legislation, then they should be looking right across the country in every institution, because there is systemic racism everywhere. And so those 4 areas for me are the top ones.
It provides these recommendations which we can bind to, we can support them. No question on that. And secondly, I think it was Winston who made the point that the report has a lot of data that can be used otherwise. And so that's another positive thing.
You know, I'm going to be different and say I found nothing. Because these are self-evident. What the recommendations are recommending, that this should be a part of the way race and equality should be managed by institutions. And therefore, as far as I'm concerned, the recommendations are a diversion to a report that one word is that these are fudges, which in fact should be part of the way the society is managed anyway.
I think, as I said, there's a lot of data in the report that if you're analytical, because in terms of their competence, they weren't competent enough to know that you shouldn't put the data in there because people will actually see it and then deconstruct the false arguments that you're trying to make. So they put the data in, and so people can actually look at the data for themselves. And this report, in a sense, the other positive is that it was produced for a Tory government by a Tory government. So they will actually try and implement, basically what I'm saying is, when they try and implement the recommendations, they will have to go back to the report and all the data, and the people who are going to try to implement will look at the data properly, and they might actually see, right, that some of the conclusions were wrong, but the recommendations were right, and so they'll hopefully use the data to properly implement what should have been implemented, because the recommendations, most people agree, they're not too bad. They're not brilliant, and they're not revolutionary. They are, a lot of them are obvious. And so if you're going to implement the recommendations, you have to go back to the data, which is in the report. And because the data is in the report and everyone in senior positions in the government accept it, they can't say, no, we're ignoring that. So I'm hoping, fingers crossed, that perhaps because the report has the data and the recommendations, forget the general comments that make no sense and contradictory stuff, make no sense. So that's how I'm seeing it. Hopefully people will use the data and the report and the recommendations and sort of, we'll get some wins out of it. But we have to...
Maybe a bit biased here. This call is about, we need as a community to invest more and more in education. Because the government will not solve all problems for us. We'll have to find a route for our own children to progress and to develop and to become successful. The education system as it stands will not do it. We have to be doing it for the last 40 years or so. Our children have been invested in by groups and so forth. Many of you have been part of many community groups to help our children. So we have to invest more ourselves in education. It's not about a dependency on the state to get us where. I'm not saying they shouldn't do what they ought to do. They should, but we'll have to invest more. Because if we don't invest, we can't gain. It's a logical thing. You invest to profit. We need to invest more and mobilize our community along the lines of having more social capital developed by ourselves to invest in our children. So that's number one. Number two, I think it will help if you can. It's more long term here. If you can change that cycle and break that cycle in terms of education, then it will impact on issues such as employment in the long run too. It will also help with the generation of wealth in our community, because we're still lagging there. We're still again at the end. So if we can get education right, employment better, we will also get the creation of wealth for our community at a level that will create a better socio-economic position for people. So in summary, my offer is that we need to be looking at self-determination. That is not to say we shut up and not press the argument for change, but the focus ought to be on us ensuring that we create the opportunity for self-development. It takes matters into our own hands.
I think it was brilliant what Keith said in terms of I think it will be about self-determination and self-reliance. I did have a word with Dwain about this, and I agree with him. I think there are three aspects of the next steps. I think it's the government stuff. Obviously, there's stuff for us as a community. And what I would like to mention, because I can't repeat what Keith said very eloquently, but I do think we need to think about issues around, lobbying. There are other things that we need to do that would help, I think. Certainly in terms of around the legislation and, getting the government to try and enact Section 1 of the Equality Duty. It's been there for years and it's just sitting there. It's never been written to law. That's the socio-economic duty. I mean, I think that's quite a big thing. I think extending the public sector duty to the private sector, I think would be brilliant. I also think that reintroducing or reinstating pressure and instruction to discriminate into the Equality Act is not there anymore is important, because employment agencies, which was a major area where pressure and instructions were given by employers, and everybody knows here that they find work for millions of people. And that's why it's so important, because employers use them to put them under pressure and give them instructions to discriminate in terms of what the proper person they want. And I think the other thing, and I don't accept that another report tried to make an argument for about why we shouldn't have the ethnicity pay gap should be mandatory, but I think we should be pressing it for it to be mandatory.
Look, I think some of you will have heard me saying, for our community to continue to establish itself and thrive, we need to be clear about the pincer strategy that we adopt and follow. And for me, one side of that pincer is to make sure that we track what government does with respect to our community, so that we can vote accordingly. And this report basically has said to me, the government does not have any compassion for our community. Yeah. And if it doesn't have any compassion, it doesn't have any empathy for the suffering we have been going through over the last 73 years, but it also doesn't intend to do anything about it. So we need to track to see that that message coming out of this report is ongoing. Now, we can't sit on our hands if the government is inactive or disinterested. So that sense of agency that Keith has already talked about is absolutely crucial if we are going to not only save our community, but thrive. So I have several things that I would say are next steps for our community to do. We must be very clear about what we are doing to protect our children. because the hostility in the education sector is unrelenting. And too many of our young people, including our boys especially, continue to suffer in that hostile environment. We also need to do more to inspire our young people. The negative messages of 40, 50 years ago are still being trotted out to our young people. And we as a community need to embrace the task of inspiring young people. And Reach Society have stepped right into the center of that activity.
But anyway, Angela, Winston and Sir Geoff, any, next steps for the modern Black community?
I think that Dwain has summed this up quite nicely, and Keith as well. But I was thinking about it when Keith was speaking. That education, it runs across everything. It runs across health in education. I think education is the key, but it's how we ensure that there is a proper understanding of what is required of the people who provide the services. So what is required of the teachers? What are required of the health service? What is required? Recognizing that, yes, there is institutional racism across services. What education can we bring to these places? I mean, I work in health, so I take it as my responsibility. I'm not going to walk away from here shaking my head. I feel that I have a responsibility to educate, to inform, to raise awareness, the health inequalities that we're talking about, to do something about it. So yeah, I suppose when I think about what this report says and talks about an agency, it sounds like we do have to do it ourselves because it's not going to be done for us. So so I'm happy to take that responsibility.
I'm sorry I'm going to have to do this, but in my analysis is totally different, and I'm going to tell you why. We've just spent the last hour and a half taking apart this report, and the central, if you like, theme or whatever point of the report is basically, if there are any racial disparities, it's because those ethnic minorities, or whatever term you want to use, haven't worked hard enough. They haven't put their back to it. They haven't, they just haven't worked hard enough. And that is the reason why they are suffering the disparities they have. And we've just said that all that's nonsense. So if we are saying all that's nonsense, because racism, the thing about racism, it doesn't matter how much agency you have, agency cannot overcome that kind of discrimination. It just won't work. It doesn't matter how educated you are, how rich you are, whatever it is. Racism, that kind of racism, look at all those, rich celebrities in Hollywood who still get stop and search. So just saying that we need to take it on ourselves, and we're going to educate our children more, and we're going to do all those. Sadly, that's not ultimately the answer. So we know it's not about our agency. We have agency, but what we need to do is keep calling out. Look, the general population don't want to be seen as racist, and we need to keep reminding them that there's racism. That's what we need to keep reminding them, that there's racism, so that they can actually do something about it. It's not ourselves.
Okay, good point. And finally, Sir Geoff.
Well, thank you very much. I'll be as quick as I can. It seems that where we've come to is we're saying that there is institutional racism. After all this, and the report is saying it doesn't exist. Yeah. And therefore that is a problem for us, because what we're saying, it exists. So this report, to me, my view is it should be completely ignored or challenged still on that point alone. Because if we drift and give a whole lot of arguments here and there, we've all come to the same conclusion at the end, that it does exist. And if it exists, what are we going to do for our own people? Sewell says our own people, it's our own people's fault. The Black Caribbeans are have got less capacity to do than Black Africans. The point is that is not true. That's a form of racism, in a sense that there are no differences between peoples in this world. I don't believe that. And I don't believe they're right or wrong universities. University is a university, and a good degree is a good degree. The point is people ask for that. And the other point is that I therefore feel that if we're saying our institutions are not going to address these disparities because they are racist, then in fact, we should be challenging that. Challenging the concept that our institutions, if they are racist, then they must change. And we must challenge them on that. And if whilst we're doing that, we can still, like Reach Society does, it pays attention to the education of Black kids with capacity, with abilities. And the point is that we could do that as well. But we must not, in fact, do it in a non-constructive manner. If we're going to do something, it must be constructive, because we don't do it for 6 months or 1 year and then quit. So yes, I agree, we should do something to help. However, at the same time, we have an institution where we pay tax for, and therefore these institutions must be challenged to address the issues that we've all come to agree that there is institutional racism. And this report must be changed and adjusted and still attacked until it disappears, that it changed that view that institutional racism does not exist. It does.
Self-determination is not isolation.
No.
It's to have a stronger platform to be able to challenge racism.
Yeah.
And in my sort of 40 years, I've never retreated from challenging the issue of racism, wherever it might be.
Well, can I say to everyone, this has been a thoroughly enjoyable, insightful, and provoking discussion. And above all, it is about what Dwain had envisaged, the idea of, ask our experts. And this has really been a thorough discussion of an important issue. The overall conclusions that I draw from hearing all your points is that there's almost been a concerted effort to deny that racism exists. And yet, as you've all mentioned, but when you look at the recommendations, when you look at the data, it's irrefutable that not just racism exists, but systemic and structural racism, which what the 4 commission reports from Reach Society highlighted, and I know others have submitted, which the authors, for whatever reason, choose to ignore. Equally, and the point's been raised, is a disturbing pattern of actually blaming the victim that came across, which I suspect, listening to the feedback people gave, that was why a lot of people were really angry at the report, and that came across, and yet, as you say, it's partly it's blaming the victim, and then as Angela and others have pointed out, it's then, and others have said this, it's a lack of acknowledgement of the lived experience. And again, it's overall, therefore, then it's been what referred to, as many have referred to, as a missed opportunity. A missed opportunity, because what's quite interesting is that while this report has tried to dampen things down, tried to remove the idea of racism or structural racism, what's quite interesting, organizations, institutions are actually already doing things. Yeah. The irony of it all, institutions are saying, hold on a moment, we've got to address this. We've got to, so it's almost a case the report is not in sync even with what society thinks. Yeah. In general, when we talk about allies, because one of the things that's quite clear with the Macpherson report, it changed the game. Most people would acknowledge the Macpherson report changed the game. And what they're hoping for is that it seems, can we do the same by saying, oh, no, it doesn't exist. But the plethora of comments and criticism, and really the interrogation that we've done today, clearly demonstrate that they've got that wrong. But nevertheless, there are some points that was raised in terms of, the ERHC getting additional funding the police and better relationship, the Office for Health Disparities, the fitness of teachers in education. And also the key thing is there's a lot of data. So potentially others can look at the data and then also draw different conclusions. So can I say a huge thanks to the panelists, Angela Clarke, Keith Davidson, Dr. Winston Morgan, Dr. Dwain Neil OBE, Professor Geoff Palmer, Paul Riddell. Thank you all for your insight and your clarity by looking at this report.